So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, I'm pleased to have you. So that's lucky we're a good duo, aren't we?
Absolutely. Let's have a dance.
I love it. You just be careful which sort of dancing. But
Yes. I know we're on tape. We're on tape.
That's great. So, Michael, I'm so keen to chat with you. And you do you're a happiness coach. Like let's just put it in under one umbrella, a happiness coach. And you know, I find that really I find it fantastic. It's inspiring. It's great. It's all of those great things. Happiness is one of those words, that we fling around. And I remember when I worked in teaching disengaged youth, and I said to one of the other teachers, I said, "What is happiness?" And he said, "Happiness is happiness." And I said, "Yeah, but how do you know when you're happy?" Like, and it created a conversation that went on for months and months and months about happiness. So I find the happiness topic very, very interesting, and I find that a lot of people have their own interpretations of where they sit on the happiness scale and what it actually means. So I'm glad to be talking about it with you today.
Yes. No, same here. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy.
Right. So, okay. So it's interesting because in a sense it's multi-layered, right?
Yeah.
We tend to call happiness when something in us gets fulfilled or gratified, or we experience a certain amount of pleasure. And indeed, if you look at some of the literature, especially say around Seligman, the Martin Seligman, who's sort of like the father of positive psychology, he suggests this sort of delineation between the kind of happiness that comes out of the fact that we are pleased about something or a need has been gratified. And then there's something in terms of delivering or embodying, our values, our sense of what we're good at, and that gets sort of fulfilled. And then there is this whole much bigger conversation around meaning and purpose. And do I feel like I'm expediting on my meaning and purpose in life, that sort of stuff. And so I think the trick for us is that we tend to kind of confuse happiness with a whole lot of stuff that we yearn for, and then when we get it fulfilled, in whether it's temporary or in the long terms, then there is a sense of like, okay, I must be happy. But sooner or later, most of us discover that, okay, even the happiness that came from getting that thing that I wanted doesn't seem to last. So I would like to suggest that we could look at it in two different ways. One is there is a sort of a temporary happiness that is the relief of a need or the achievement of a yearning, or the connection with another human being that is fulfilling for us. All good.
Yep.
And all worthy of explorations and trying to figure out, what is it that makes that work for me. And then there is this kind of like a sense of contentment that comes out of understanding that you have the capacity to deal with the difficulties in life. And even when you're down from, whatever it is that happens, because we're not in control, and life tends to be up and down, sometimes it's sunny and sometimes it's raining. If we're able to get to a point where our happiness is not a derivative of our direct experience or conditions, more an inner state of mind and heart in which we rest assured in our capacity to be able to hold on to what we see dear in life, and to have a sense that whatever happens outside, I know how to handle it. That is a kind of like a happiness that I'm aiming for in my coaching and my training work. So it's a sense of resilience in a way in which I trust myself to be anchored and not flowing as to, well, today's a bad day, so I'm really unhappy. And today's a great day, I'm really happy. And then there is no stability in it. So I think those two need to play together for us to be really fulfilled.
Yeah, I love that you're saying about resilience too, because I have this real solid this is my interpretation of resilience, and because of my own resilience, is that for me, I've got this underpinning optimism, and it's that for me that, and I've seen it in others, is that belief that things are always going to, it'll be okay tomorrow, it'll be okay around the corner, just keep going, because no matter what today throws at you, there's always a belief in a better tomorrow and a better next hour. Everything's going to
Absolutely.
be okay.
Yeah.
So I think that, sorry, I'm curious about the people who seek this. So like it's not just I'm seeking happiness, it's also I'm seeking self-knowledge. I'm seeking to understand myself on a deeper level, because you can't just say I want to be happy and therefore if I accept this that's going to happen, because you've got to actually change a deeper level underneath you, and that quest for self-knowledge sometimes scares people, so like I'm joining self-knowledge with what you're doing. So what would you call self-knowledge? Like, how would you explain it, or define it?
I love that. I love that. Because if we really want to address that second kind of inner layer of happiness that is got less to do with the outside experience and more to do with what I decide to anchor myself in, that in my experience cannot come without self-knowledge. So I think the fact that you're connecting it as such is absolutely to the point, right? And in fact, if you look again at the literature, some people talk about this idea of, hedonic versus eudaimonic sort of happiness, in which hedonic is that pleasure sort of part, right? Enjoyment. But the one that is eudaimonic, which is an older sort of term, is really about the meaning and purpose. And you cannot figure out your meaning or purpose without actually understanding yourself, without knowing yourself. So when we talk about self-knowledge, it's a little bit like we really need to start to understand who am I. And when I say who am I, then you need to sort of you want to tap into the experience of what happens to you when you express yourself as I. You say, I am, right? I'm being interviewed to a podcast. I'm feeling happy today. I'm feeling not so happy today. That experience of I is actually almost like a constant feature in the way that we identify ourselves with something.
Yeah.
I might say I'm Australian, I'm an immigrant, obviously, but I might say, okay, I feel like I'm Australian. I've been here on and off for a couple of decades. And when I say I'm Australian, that experience involved two different parts. It involved this experiential, felt felt sense of I, that I feel myself as I am, and then some sort of a description or an identity, which can be, I'm a man, I'm an Australian, I believe in this particular God or in that particular God, all that sort of stuff, right? So there is this self-knowledge allow you to explore the tension or the continuum between that experience of I, which if you tune into it really interestingly, is common to every human being on the planet. In other words, there is this sort of universal identity, sometimes it is called. I think Alain de Botton was talking about this idea. The universal identity of being a human being, which is whatever it is that you are, you're still looking for happiness. You still want that you're not hungry. Like that is common to everyone, right? You still get upset if someone is laughing at you. And that tension between that experience of I and then the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, which is also part of our self-knowledge. Like, how do we identify ourselves with how do our values show up in terms of what we stand for and what not. But in that sort of continuum, which is both a continuum and a tension, because we tend to either connect with that experience of, I'm an Australian, I'm an older man, blah, 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 blah. But I always have that experience underneath of I am, right? That the exploration of self-knowledge. And so when someone like Socrates says, know thyself, he talks about this important feature of turning inward and reflecting to understand who is that I, right? What does that mean? And how do I show up in that in a way fulfilling for me?
I love that. I think that it's scary for a lot of people. You know, I run, you know, leadership workshops, and I get people to put on paper, you know, who they are and all that kind of stuff. And there's often, how can I say it? Often not a resistance, but a stalling. It's a like, I don't know who I am, you know, and if I put it on paper, it seems to be really, you know, I have to face it, you know, that kind of thing. And do you think did does it take a particular person? I don't know, you might not know the answer to this, but you know, the people that you've dealt with, do you think it takes a particular type of person to seek self-knowledge, to, you know, to then sort of chase happiness, or then to sort of chase contentment? Or do you think that it comes from being in a really shitful place, you know, with really solid adversity? Like what makes us reach a point, do you think, that says, oh, I want to know myself better, I really want to sit in contentment, I really want to find peace? I don't know, you might not know the answer, but I'm curious.
Well, I can't say that I know the answer for every person. I think it's a very individual
Yeah.
pursuit. That said, there does seems to be a connection between the experience of suffering for which we cannot make sense and the beginning of a process by which you start to asking deep questions, like, what is the meaning of all that? Why am I suffering? Like, you know, I'm being a good person, I'm doing everything that, you know, sort of I think is the right thing to do, and still life doesn't seem to work. What's going on? And of course, you know, this is not a new question. Like, if you look at the
Yeah.
Bible,
Yeah.
the book of Job, right, in the Old Testament, is all about that. How come there's a good man who's, you know, like, who's suffering and he's losing all his, you know, sort of his family and his possessions, and how come, you know, people who are supposedly not so good, they seem to be thriving, all that sort of stuff, and we still see it around us today. So this sort of exploration of what is it that I'm here for, and why does it seems to be that I'm suffering, but I know that I kind of like, I deserve better, or I want better, or all that sort of inner deliberation. Sorry, I'm as I said, I'm sitting in a car and there's a very noisy truck next to
Oh,
me.
I can't hear it. That's good.
Okay, fantastic. That deliberation in itself is already the process by which we start to ask questions about who we are, right?
Yeah.
And some people need a lot of suffering before they do that, right? They need to be getting, you know, like, they believe in some an idea and it doesn't work, and then they try again and it doesn't work, and they try again and it doesn't work. And then they're like, okay, like, obviously the strategy that I'm engaging with, that I think will get me the results I want in life, does not work. Why doesn't it work? Who am I? Blah, 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 blah. Or sometimes you get people who are just naturally connected to, you know, this sense of, you can talk about seeking, you can talk about a sense of a spiritual you know, sort of interest. Some people have that sense because they got it through their, you know, through their tradition and through their parenting, and they naturally connect with it. Some people resent it when they're children, and then they find it, you know, as older people, maybe in a different, like, for example, I grew up in a Jewish tradition, and yet probably most of the relationship that I have with my own experience in life, if I needed to use a language to explain it, I would use more a language around, you know, the Buddhist tradition and some other traditions that I've sort of explored along the way. So I think that it's a long way to say that it's a very individual thing. I think most of us are driven to something deeper, something meaningful. We want a connection with meaningful. We meant to have that connection. There is a fascinating work done by a woman, I think her name is Lisa Miller, from the US, who is a psychologist, who is exploring the connection between spirituality and the mind.
Yeah.
He actually discovers that there is certain parts in our brain that are literally wired to develop that spiritual connection.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, that same parts are parts that are also participate in when people feeling, for example, lack of meaning, lack of purpose. That's the parts of the brains that are participating in the experience of being depressed. So there is obviously something in our makeup, our psychological makeup, that is meant to wander and connect with call it the divine, call it the greater good, call it the experience of consciousness. And that if that doesn't happen, sooner or later, we might feel that we need that and we go and seek it, right?
Mm.
Very individual at the end of the day.
And I don't think we'll ever answer it either. I think it's a very, very, very deep philosophical discussion that could go on for, well, it has gone on, as you say, the book of Job has gone on for thousands and thousands. Socrates, the thousands of years. But it's one thing I've noticed is you seem to reach a point in your life, as you just sort of said, you seem to reach, and often it'll happen by age. I see a lot of people hit the 50s and they're like, oh, screw all this stuff. I don't care what people think anymore. I'm looking after me. I'm going to find my own happiness. But there's this interesting thing that's happening with teenagers. And I know when I was a teenager, I didn't give a toss about any of that sort of stuff. But there's this kind of, and I'm really curious about this because I do a lot of work with young people. It seems to be a divide. Like there are a lot of teenagers that are kind of, I don't even want to know about that stuff. I'm so distracted by my phone. I couldn't care less about the stuff that you're talking about. But then there's another type, and I'm not saying there's only two, but another type that they're saying, I want justice in this world. I want meaning and purpose. I want to only support companies that are doing good and giving back. And, there seems to be this almost two different types of teenagers. Do you reckon that we should be teaching this stuff to teenagers, or do you think their brain's too young? Do you think, what do you think?
No, I don't think so, for three reasons. First of all, if you look at our historical sort of progression or evolution of our culture, up till very recently, most teenagers had a spiritual underlay because it was just part and parcel of a culture or a tradition, right? Like this sort of a very unusual situation by which the culmination of 200 years of scientific development and the disillusionment that has come through with sort of like the religious echelons of the world in a variety of traditions, and the sense of individualism that has crept through the 60s and the 70s, all of that has culminated in a sort of a generation that is largely, in a sense, not engaged with spirituality. But that's a very recent phenomenon, right? And so if people grow up, they grow up in a particular garden and they tend to be nourished by whatever was watering that garden, or depends again on their private circumstances, they might rebel against that garden, right? So again, it's a very individual story, but by and large, the identity of not having a spiritual connection is relatively new. The second thing is, and this is going to sound a little bit woo-woo almost, but
good.
Let's do woo-woo. Back to that sort of first question that we were talking about, who am I? Who is that I, right? The individual I. One way to look at the idea of us being conscious within the experience of daily life as part of humanity and part of this experience, call it planetarians, right? Like we're part of this species on the planet. Everything suggests that there is some interconnectedness that sort of underpins that, right? Whether it's you look through physics, you look through biology, you look at sort of the psychology of how we evolve together with certain ideas. And so imagine this notion that when you look at the wave on the ocean, right, that ocean is showing itself up through individual waves, but the water in the waves are still the water of the ocean. In other words, in that metaphor, I might feel like a separate individual entity, an individuation of the experience of consciousness that is showing up as who I am in my story, but I'm also always part of the ocean. I have my own volition, I have my own shape, I have my own form, I have my own identity, the way that I understand myself, but I'm also part of that ocean as well. I'm the wave and I'm the ocean. And so the second answer to this, in terms of the teenagers, we're also always part of that. There isn't a point in which we're not somehow part of that complex whole that seems to be pulsating and evolving and sort of operating as a collective, right? And so even if we not connect with it on an individual level, we are very much still part of that, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so it's always available for us. And at certain times, we might have experiences that helps us to sort of get a glimpse of that. Sometimes it will show in you having very similar thoughts to someone who you connected with.
Yep.
And you go, oh, I was just thinking exactly the same, right? And that seems to happen by and large more with people who are you vibrate with more closely, right, than just random people in the street. So I think that happens there. In other words, those teenagers might not feel that they seek or they're interested in a spiritual identity, but they're still part of the ocean. You know, they might see themselves as very individual waves that have got nothing to do with the rest, but maybe there's something there as well, right? Third thing is that ultimately I feel that most of us as teenagers grow up with a yearning for the greater good. It is in our natural tendency to wish for you know, sort of like the overall goodness of the group, right? And it makes sense in an evolutionary sort, because me looking after you, you looking after me makes, you know, gives better chances for both of us to survive. But it also makes sense in our natural being, which is wired toward empathy, which is wired towards, you know, sort of looking after the group or after you know, someone in my own tribe, if I want to sort of bring it down to that level. But there's always this sort of sense of interconnectedness, whether I'm calling it that way or I'm aware of it that way. I'm wired for that. I'm wired to be part of a group. I'm wired to respond to that. If I'm going to paraphrase, I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas who was talking about the God-shaped hole. I think we're all walking around with a tribe-shaped hole in our heart. You know, we were meant to live that way. And so as teenagers, when we grow up, we look for that. And we try and find it in the fact that we are idealistic and we find things that are important for us to believe in. And then we work towards it. I mean, look at the environmental movement around the world, and how it is now being kind of led by young people in, you know, between you know, sort of teens and mid-20s. Those are the people who are really the passionate sort of pushers and leaders of that sort of movement, because they really feel connected to that. Well, most of us, you know, especially people who look like us, we're a little bit more cynical, and we kind of like spend a whole lot of our times, you know, being more busy about whatever, right? At that age, you're looking for that, you know, how do I serve the greater good? There is a wiring inside us that meant to do that.
Yeah. Well, I love all that. Firstly, I love the metaphor. That is a fantastic metaphor, and I've heard similar to that before, and it is very, 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 very true. And I love the fact that you're talking about frequency. You know, I think that a lot of people don't even consider that, but I can feel the frequency of others that are my frequency. You know, and it's just very, very, very easy to be connected to those people. I think it's interesting when you're talking about the teenagers and the environmental movement too, is that I've spoken to our own teenagers about it, and they've said, yeah, I'm worried about it, but I don't care about it. But that's just their language, because I don't know what to do. So in actual fact, they're really quite scared, but they don't actually have the tools to do anything about it. I think the kids are the future of our planet, and we need to support them. I support a lot of young people around the world with climate change projects, and you know, I think it's really important. Michael, I'm interested, just going back one step, because I thought to ask you, and then I try to focus on what you're saying instead of holding a question, and I lost it completely. What got you into this journey? Like, why? You know, we were talking about before adversity, and you know, people start seeking and all that kind of stuff. What was it for you that said, I'm going to be a happiness coach? You might not have said that at first, but like, what pushed you into that journey that ended you up? That's a really good English, but anyway, had you ending up as a happiness coach?
I guess you could say that I had two you know, two motifs that kept appearing in my life that sort of over time directed me towards that. The first was that I grew up in the Middle East, and you know, in a fairly precarious situation in terms of the local politics and the dynamics around me. And so I grew up believing in a particular narrative of survival and the idea of, like you have to protect yourself against others and all that. And then as a young man, when I actually became a soldier and participated in that process, I came out of it convinced that this can't be the right way to solve things. Like I could, I didn't have the emotional depth or the vocabulary to be able to explain at the time what I was feeling, but I knew that it was wrong. And so that drove me into a sort of a process of what you could call a soul searching of some sort, where I really tried to understand how is it possible that based on a particular narrative, we choose to do things that don't feel like they're in our inherent nature. And how can we be so convinced of that narrative to the point where we're prepared to kill someone else for it? And there was a really long process of reckoning in terms of what's okay and what's not okay. Like, do I never lift a hand when someone else is lifting a hand on me? Like, where is the right line there? And I'm not saying that I can justify, oh, this is the right line and this is not the right line. I'm just saying that there is an individual choice in that. And when you grow up as a young person in those situations, you don't understand that there is an individual choice in that, because you don't even know that it's possible to think that way. Everyone else is speaking in a particular language. You buy into that language. And so that in itself sort of threw me into that process of trying to unearth, who am I? Am I that story? What happened if I suffer amnesia and then I get up tomorrow morning and I have no idea about that story in terms of my origin? Does that story still hold value? Or can I find another story that holds value? So all that sort of process, in other words, to use the language that we used previously, I was trying to figure out, am I the wave? Am I the ocean? What does that look like? Why do I become a wave? How do I stop being a wave? How do I go back to the ocean? That sort of stuff. The second thing is that I also realized that there are good days and bad days. So sometimes I get up in the morning and the day is great, and other times I get up in the morning and the day is shit. And I thought to myself, okay, so I can choose to just sort of fluctuate with the experience of the day in terms of how I feel about it. But I also got to see that sometimes the day is shit and I still feel good. Or sometimes it's great and I still feel shit. And that didn't make sense to me. Like, what is it that creates the experience of feeling great that's got nothing to do with the circumstances of that day? And that exploration led me to understand that kind of happiness that I'm talking about, the happiness of being anchored in the conviction of the goodness in life, regardless of what's your experience for that day, being anchored in the interconnectedness that is surrounding us, and trusting it and trusting the natural intelligence that arises through that. That happiness is what I want to kind of figure out for myself. And then, I wouldn't claim to have, arrived at any particular state, but I saw that there are certain practices that allow you to rest more and more in that state with being while being less frazzled by circumstances. And then I looked around and I saw there's a lot of people who seems to be struggling with that, right? Maybe I can work with this. So it was a sort of an evolution that took a lifetime, I guess. But I certainly didn't start thinking, oh, I'm going to, sort of coach people about that, as much as the combination of the process and the models that I was interested in looking through ended up bringing me into that position.
Well, I love that. I love that. And I think I love what you're saying about the traditional narratives, and that we just buy into it. So I think all kids buy into whatever's being told around them. And when you're talking about war, it's kind of like, do I believe in this so much that I would kill? And I often think about that recently, with the Russian soldiers, and I absolutely, I'll go on record. I hate what Russia's doing to, with Ukraine. I bloody hate it. And there are going to be so many broken lives, not only in Ukraine, but also families around the world. But I think one of the things we tend to forget too are the lives of those young Russian soldiers in exactly the same situation as you were, that they're sort of sent in there. And there's got to be many of them that are brainwashed and then come out with, like you, that questioning, my life's now ruined because I killed people, because of a narrative that I believed in, and I didn't have the emotional intelligence, perhaps, to even question if why I was doing that, even though deep down I knew it was wrong. And I think that the sooner we do start, really assigning our values and what's really important and start asking the big questions, the sooner we do that in life, the sooner we can start saying, well, no, it's not okay to follow somebody else's narrative, and it's not okay to, unless it's for good, unless it's actually, and when you talk about being a tribe, we've got to be better at saying, well, are my actions and are my beliefs and my narrative actually contributing to the bigger tribe? The ocean, as you say, am I a wave that's just splashing all over the place, or am I a wave that's actually carrying this ocean to a good place? And yeah, it's a deep question and a deep thought, and it can, I think you can, I'm a wondering type person. I wonder and wonder and wonder and ask all the time. And I think sometimes you can get yourself, I get myself into a little frazzle because I can ask for too long. But I think when we don't ask, we don't, Margaret Mead was great. She was an educator, and she said we should teach children how to think and not what to think. And I think that's such a critical thing. If we all start thinking how to think and are taught how to think, then I think a lot of things in here, but we start to ask the questions that guide us to the stuff you're talking about, and even if we can't figure it out ourselves, it leads us to people like you, to say, well, what are your thoughts on this? How can you help me? And mentors, coaches, sometimes they only appear for 3 months, or something, or they could be for 2 years, but it's that next step, it's that next piece of the puzzle that we can put together and start to build ourselves into who am I and how am I contributing to this.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I want to paraphrase a story because I want to take out of it any kind of reference to a particular tradition. I think the point that it makes is universal.
Yeah.
And the story is someone who was asking a spiritual teacher, how do you define spirituality? And he said, well, you need to look for 2 parameters. The first one is it your own experience? In other words, it's not something that you would just read in a book. I mean, you might read it in a book and tried it and practice it and saw if it works for you. But it's not just something that someone else said or something, you got from another source, and it's not your own experience, right? And the second is that if the practice of it in some way or somehow leads to the cessation of suffering, any kind of suffering, your suffering, someone else's suffering, an animal's suffering, planetary suffering, whatever it is, right? And so if you can apply those 2 principles, you're now in the land of being a spiritual being, of being connected to what we're here to do, what we're here to grow for, right? And I think in that sense, the idea of how do I experience being a wave while figuring out my part of the ocean, how do I do that, is really kind of on course, because you don't actually need to know content, right? You just need to ask the right questions in terms of how you're going to figure out this minute and then the next minute and then the next minute.
Yep.
And if you think about it like that, it becomes really quite interesting, because you can take the narrative of any questions that you ever need to ask yourself or make a decision, or any dilemma that you ever face, or any choice that you ever need to make. And you can look at it at the level of the narrative, and the narrative will tell you, well, that's the story and that's the decision you need to make. And those are the possible results. All good, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But you can strip it down to the architecture of each decision. And lo and behold, the architecture of each decision is this decision, in the way that I make that choice, is going to contribute towards more harmony, more love in the world, more connection, or not.
Yeah.
Right? And if you start your working assumptions on how I'm going to make a good decision from looking for that edge, like, is this going to help or is this going to disturb? Is this going to connect or is this going to rip apart? How is it this decision is going to help? rather than try and figure it out at the narrative level, which confuses us because there's so many multiple narratives running at the same time.
Mm.
That's a really good guidance in terms of like, what's next for me.
And it even goes deeper than that. And I absolutely love that. And I always think that, how is it going to benefit the greater good? But sometimes when you're talking about, is it going to rip apart? Is it going to cause a problem? Is it going to, I also think that sometimes we are going to upset at a micro level in order to be a bigger contribution at a macro level. Sometimes we've got to disagree with people that we wish we didn't have to do that, but I am going to call you out on it. I am going to take you up on it, because you're causing this tension that is actually causing suffering to the greater good, and therefore I'm going to call you out and cause tension myself with you, because I want the greater good to be. It's big stuff, but I absolutely love this stuff. So what about we're talking about self-knowledge, and you talked about contentment, happiness and contentment at the very start. There's a lot of talk around about mindfulness and sitting in a space, and where I was talking about wondering, you were talking about asking questions, you're thinking, and that mindfulness is, I think that's an important part of this. How do you see it, and how do you see it fitting into this?
I love that. So first of all, there seems to be, a lot of mindfulness has become very ubiquitous, right? It's like there's mindfulness in business, and mindfulness in painting, and all good. I'm not judging any of it, or I'm not berating any of it, but I'm just saying that because there's so many streams and strands now to the conversation around mindfulness, it's really good for us to sort of get to a point where we have an understanding of how does it show up as content and how does it show up as process, right?
Yeah.
And so as content or as an explanation, it's essentially the ability that we have at any given moment to be present with our experience, not to judge it, and to have the awareness that we're present with our experience.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see children being really focused on doing something, when they kind of like, they do something and they stick their tongue out, right? They're being really there. They're really present with what they're doing, but there's no awareness of doing that. They just totally in the experience. That's kind of there's a level of mindfulness in it, but the mindfulness that we talk about in terms of like, okay, what's the orientation toward the mindful experience is you're aware of having that experience. You're aware of being aware of having that experience. And you have that experience without preference to it's good experience or bad experience. You're just being present with it. The technology of it, right? The process of it. How do you actually become mindful? That's very interesting, because most of us tend to assume that, oh, you mean like sitting on the cushions and, spending 20 minutes a day trying not to think. That's the kind of like, the overall sort of perception of it. But actually, can we be present in any given moment? Can I be present while I drive a car? Can I be present while I eat my food? Can I be present while I'm having this conversation? That is fascinating to me, because it only takes 1 second to get into presence. We just need to be aware of our breath in this moment right now, and suddenly I'm present. Like we have the capacity to be, we have this sort of magic elevators to be present in any given moment, simply by becoming aware of the fact that I'm breathing. And for as long as I'm breathing, I can do that, right? And so how do I apply this ability to connect with the present moment and stay present through all the moments that I tend to be out of presence by thinking about the future or the past? That's really where the practice becomes, right? How do I do enough of that so it becomes my resting space? It becomes my go-to when I want to do something. I start with being mindful rather than, just being on automatic pilot. So the research suggests that most of us, around about 95% of the time, 98% of the times, are unconscious of what we're doing. In other words, we do stuff, but we're not there. How many times, and all of us have had that experience, you get into the car and you drive to work or you drive back from work, and you get home or you get to work and you realize, I wasn't in the car that whole.
Yep.
Where was I, right? Now, that's okay. There's nothing, there's nothing that, like, it's not about a good experience or a bad experience, but it's the awareness of that capacity to stay in the present moment with the experience that we have in, and then develop the ability to move backward and allow the space of in between me and the experience. There is the capacity for me to choose whether I want to judge that experience or not. And there is the capacity in me to decide how am I going to judge that experience. That gives you a lot of power in terms of happiness, because most of the time we're unhappy is because we're arguing with reality. Something happened and we don't like it in ourselves, or we don't like it with other people, or we don't like the circumstances. And now we are, in disagreement with what's going on. And we spend a lot of time, sort of worrying about it and trying to change it and manipulating it and just being annoyed with it because it's not the way we wanted it. Or, oh, this is what's happening. Okay, and now what? Like, what's the gift? What can I learn? How can I stretch from that? Because there's not much the biggest illusion that we have. It's fascinating how much energy we spend trying to control what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's a double-edged sword, because it's that drive to control what's going on that gives me the ability to sit in an air-conditioned room, right? Or indeed drive a car. I want to control my ability to get from A to B and do it faster. That developed, amazing modes of transports, right? But it's also the same drive of control that often gives us our most unhappy moment. And if we have the illusion of control, I think anything that came out of the pandemic, and you can argue about various things around that, but one very clear opportunity to understand something about life and something about ourselves is we have no control. What's going to happen? We have control of how we're going to interact with that, but we have no control about what's going to happen. So that particular ability to differentiate between what I have power over, what I have agency over, and how do I expedite or exercise that agency in the most harmonious, expanded, happy way. That is mindfulness. That is the technology of mindfulness. And that is also what you get out of that practice, because you suddenly become a lot less perturbed by what's going on and a lot more interested and curious in your relationship with what's going on in a way that empowers you, in a way that makes, brings benefit to the group around you or the situation and so
on. I love that. And it's the word expectations is coming up in my mind as you're talking about the control, and I think expectations is, it just undoes us all the time, because nothing ever turns out the way we expect it to turn out. But I love it. So you've got a school of life in Melbourne. So am I correct in that? I think that's what or at the School of Life. No, I think you went there once.
Yeah,
Tell me about that, Michael. I'm confused.
First of all, it's definitely not my School of Life. So the School of Life is essentially an institute that was pulled together by the philosopher Alain de Botton, who's based in Europe, who reasoned that, if you want to be a lawyer or a plumber or any kind of, profession, you need to study to do that. We need to study sometimes to become, whatever, right? And yet we hardly ever seem to be able to study properly how to live life successfully.
Yep.
How to choose a partner wisely, how to choose a job wisely, how to live a job wisely, how to have a conversation, how to find meaning in life, how to enjoy life. So he developed this model in which there is a school that teaches all those classes. And in 2000, and I think 13 or 14, around 2013, around that time anyway, a local group here, Small Giants Academy, which is led by Barry Lieberman and Daniel Almagor, reached out to him and say, can we open a local branch? And so they were the first outside branch, because the original School of Life was open in London. The first branch was open here in Melbourne, and then they opened another one in Sydney. And consequently, there were other branches around the world. And so for a certain amount of time, I was part of the faculty that taught those classes. And I was fortunate enough to teach there for a few years, and I've discovered a fascinating edge to, especially to Melbourne, but in general, where I saw that people are hungry for meaningful conversations. People are hungry to, like there is a, like I said, there is a, we walk around with a wilderness and a tribe-shaped holes in our heart. There's a hunger for meaning. Like what am I here for? And how do I do it in a great way? How do I live greatly? And how do I live greatly in connections with other people? And so it was a beautiful place to work at. And unfortunately, when the pandemic sort of hit us, they were considering putting it online, but then the school in London was doing stuff online, and so they folded it. I do want to point out that they've opened a brilliant new entity called the Small Giants Academy, which do very much programs, very deep groove programs around that kind of work. And last year I had the pleasure and the fortune to co-facilitate a program on transformational leadership called Interconnected Leadership with the woman who runs their flagship program, which is the Master of Business and Empathy, Tamsin Jones. So I'm mentioning all of this is because even though the School of Life does not exist here in Australia yet, you can get classes online, and it's worthwhile to try them. I do think that there are materials and there are programs and there are courses that are available all around us, and we only have to ask. We only have to look. If we want to know something, this is a beautiful aspect of the universe that can be captured in the old adage of ask and you shall be, sort of given.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're curious about something, by the fact that you are curious about it, you will start to notice the opportunities that the universe make available for you to understand and grow and learn and expand yourself into that domain. So,
Michael, 100%, because I've got a sign up here. I'm so big on that. It's a sign that I look at every day. For God's sake, Karen, tell the universe what you want. And it's just the universe responds, and so we just have to sit with it. I'm curious about this. You said about Melbourne, that there seems to be this theme about Melbourne, this sort of difference about Melbourne that is got this hunger for inquiry, about life. Do you think that, and you're not going to know the answer, but I'm just going to sort of put something in your mind so that you can ponder even further. Melbourne is considered, one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and I just wonder how much those two are connected. That I see all these people around me, and we have an acceptance, generally speaking. I'm not saying that other cities don't have the same acceptance, but that's I wonder if it's a lot of it is stemmed from a curiosity about who are these people around me, what's their background, where do they come from, what have they been through, what is their life. I don't know, I'm making that up, but it just sort of hit me really strongly. I thought, I wonder what the connection between the big questions and a deep cultural awareness is. Don't know.
I would tend, we sort of speculating, no doubt, but I would tend to say that it's a fairly reasonable speculation in the sense that until you get exposed to something which is outside your usual way of being, doing, or understanding the world, you don't know that exists. Or you might be curious in general, but you can't be curious to that which you don't know. You don't know that you don't know. And then suddenly in a multicultural city, you kind of know that you don't know, because there's all these people who look differently, think differently, have different cultural connotations, and behave differently. And it's an opportunity for us, right, to grow, to kind of say, well, okay, they've arrived at that particular relationship with life. I've arrived at a different relationship with life. Let's see what we can learn from each other, right? And it's an interesting choice that all of us have available for us, by which we can see multiculturalism as a threat to our way of living, which is secure and, sort of like familiar, and it's safe, versus the curiosity and the ability to stretch outside our way of living and grow in different ways, which is the real boon of living in a multicultural society. It's interesting that originally, and this is, we haven't got to speak about it, but I think it's such an important part of the process of self-knowledge. It's really worth mentioning it. One of the reasons why we're not happy, one of the main reasons why we're not happy, one of the most difficult aspects of trying to function in a, on a level of sanity, on a level of psychological kind of robustness that is available for us in general, but it's getting challenged daily, is because our operating systems, our brains, have been nurtured and evolved to function in a very specific environment, which was survival as a small group of people on the savannah. Did it really well overall, right? But we've changed too fast, and we grew too fast, and we evolved too fast as a species in terms of the way that we live and interact with each other, for the brain to be able to hold that complexity and not freak out. So originally, the idea of seeing someone who looks differently to you was first and foremost perceived as a threat, because chances are that if they don't look like you, they're not part of your tribe. Therefore, they, they likely might want to get your water hole, or to, sort of like come hunting in your area or whatever. And so this notion of being suspicious of someone who looks differently, or someone who's not of my tribe, was actually part of the wiring that we evolved on when we evolved on the savannah. But of course, that's not relevant to us anymore. And the richness that the world is experiencing, because we have so many cultures, is the cross fertilizations of ideas and cultures and traditions and all that backgrounds that each one of us bring to the new modern city from all those cultures. That's a fantastic opportunity for us to stretch, and indeed for us to be able to deal with the kind of world-class and world-sized problems that we have. We gotta come together as a species, not as this culture, that culture. And places like Melbourne and Sydney and Australia in general, and other places where you got all those beautiful sort of mixture of cultures, right? Those are the places that give us hope for that. And interestingly enough, just as a sort of a last point, even on the level of just absolute genetics and nature, what do you happen when you get a group of people and they interbreed, versus what do you get when you get a group of people and sorry, when I mean a group of people is a homogeneous group of people and they interbreed. When you get a group of people who come from all different cultures and they and they sort of have offsprings, right? On the one hand, you get a decrepit, rapidly evolving kind of problems in terms of how we show up and how we appear, versus this, where do you find the most stunning looking people? In the Caribbeans, in New York, in Tel Aviv, in Melbourne, in place where you got different origins, different nations, different races mixed. Nature seems to like it because it creates so there's something there for us to understand. There's some, the idea that we connect across differences makes us stronger. It makes us stronger genetically, but it also makes us strong culturally.
This is not being derogatory, but it's the same with, if you've only got to look at dogs, and I mean, and I'm not, well, actually, I like dogs better than people, so I'm allowed to say it. But it's kind of like, if you look at dog species, dog breeds, the more they interbreed dogs, the more they're at the vet, the more problems they've got. It just gets worse and worse and worse. But all the dogs that we call them the Heinz variety, that's a bit of everything. Yeah. They are the most robust and balanced dogs. They are way better dogs. Way more able, more adaptable, and more capable of dealing with things. And you've got to wonder if that same philosophy doesn't apply over to the human species. It's just that the more we've got of anything else, the better we can deal with it, the more familiar it is. Even our brains, well, that's familiar to me, and this little bit's familiar, that little bit's familiar. It's sort of a lot more, it's just not as hyper-focused and hyper. We get sick with our hyper-focusism, and I made that word up, but like we do get sick. And
I love that. And the chances are in Australia that in about 2 to 3 generations, everyone is going to have a variety of skin, sort of tones. Like it's just going to be like any kind and every kind, and no one's going to care anymore.
Yeah, good.
Like it's about time that we sort of transcend that tribalism, not because it doesn't serve us, it hasn't served us originally. It served us very well. We became the strongest tribe on the planet in terms of a species. But we can't act in a tribalist manner anymore because tribalist size thinking is not going to deal with global size problem. We need
Yeah,
global size thinking. All of us need to understand it and come together.
yeah,
It's a consciousness that we need to collectively go through.
yeah. I agree. Well, with all of this, and we're all sort of learning to get off the bench, and I absolutely love that whole I love get off the bench,
Absolutely.
and so getting off the bench to, I guess, to take action, to improve our lives and to make it better. With a lot of this, I guess, philosophical exploration that you're talking about, how is that going to help us? What's the connection between the philosophical my God, I don't know if it's too early or too late in the day. Philosophical exploration. What's the connection with actually taking action? How are we gonna take the thoughts and then put it into action and get our lives moving to a much better state? What are we top tip?
Yes, absolutely. I love that. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you think, right? It really matters what you do.
Yep.
Your future life is gonna look like the total cultivation of what you did in the years before that, right?
Yep.
That's what's important. So I think it's absolutely a really good it's a must that we talk about that as the final sort of piece. So how do you take all that understanding that we talked about, self-knowledge, interconnectedness, and then how do you turn mindfulness, how do you turn it into something that actually works for you and helps you to change? And so I would suggest a couple of things indeed. The first is that it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to be worried. It's okay to kind of think what's going to be going not well, or what's going to go wrong. Not because that's a good strategy, but that's because the way that our brain is wired to think.
Mm.
There is no value for the brain to be happy, right? In a real kind of down in the savannah, try to survive the lion ways, right? The one who was happy didn't have children. It's the one who was like, where are the tigers? Where are the lions? What's going to go wrong? Who's going to attack me? Those are the people that had children, right? So we have a tendency we have a negative bias that behooves us to think about what's going to go wrong, right? Except there's no tigers around, there's no lions around, especially here in Australia. Like we are absolutely brilliantly lucky in the way that relative to most other places on the planet, we have few real problems, right? This is, like no disrespect meant to individuals who might have really tough lives, and there's lots of them. But generally, as a society and in the ability that we have to choose as individuals,
Yeah.
right, we're relatively in a good spot. And so the first practical tip is learning to identify when does your thinking serve you and when does it not. And being able to become more self-aware so you catch yourself when you think those negative thoughts. You catch yourself when you're being too worried, too much into, sort of what's going to go wrong. And being able to develop the muscle by which you recognize that it's just your habitual way of thinking. That's
Yeah.
the first. And then the second step is, well, how do I replace that sort of thinking, right?
Yeah.
So, to borrow from my dear teacher Rick Hansen, who developed this idea of positive neuroplasticity.
Mm.
What you think is what you become.
Yeah.
The way that you think about things is the way that you're going to wire your brain into perceiving things and think about them even more. And so how do we flip that switch between the natural default tendency to think about what's going to go wrong and start to think about what's going right, and how can I make it right if it doesn't go right the way I feel, that is a really interesting domain for us to explore. And it starts with very, very little kind of steps by which you want to notice the good things in your life rather than just the bad things in your life. We tend to notice what's going to go wrong, but not what's going right. So acknowledging, being grateful, writing a journal every day where you like the 3 things that went great today.
Yeah.
Being present when you're suddenly out in the garden or in nature and you see this beautiful tree, or there's a leaves floating, in front of you, or there is a beautiful happy animal like a puppy or even a baby. All of those things that are full of joy and naturally imbued with joy,
Yeah.
and we tend to overlook them. You want to start noticing them more. Make it your practice to notice the good parts of life, which we have a lot.
Yeah.
And acknowledge them and celebrate them on a regular basis, right?
Mm.
That's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is notice the places where you take yourself too seriously on a personal level.
Yeah.
Someone said something and it doesn't agree with the way you think about life. So what? Like, we love to get offended. It's a sort of a human pastime to kind of like find someone who said something that doesn't agree with what I think and then get really annoyed about it, and like, how all that sort of the heck. Why energy? Is it real for you? Just because someone thinks something doesn't make it your reality. You don't have to buy into someone else's bigotry or idiocy or the fact that they're doing something. If it impacts you, how do I get resourceful in interacting with that person so I can convince them or convert them into a more holistic way of, by all means, engage with that.
Yeah.
But getting annoyed, getting offended, taking life personally because someone said something, that's really, really wasted energy. Not fun. Why would you do that?
Yeah. So I love it. So going back to what you just said before, it's looking for the good things. It's basically rewiring our reticular activating system, isn't it? Because we get what we look for. And if we're constantly looking for good, we're going to get a lot more of good and notice a lot more of good. I like that you say,
Can I just emphasize something? It's not even get what we look for. We notice what we pay attention to.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, I think it was William James, the father of modern psychology in the US, who said something along the line, if for the moment what you pay attention to is your reality,
yeah,
your brain is perceiving at any given moment millions of bits of data. But as magnificent as it is in terms of its computing capacity, it can only process few hundreds of those every minute. And it tends to process those that you're familiar with. It tends to process those that are more aligned with what you believe the word is to be.
Yeah.
Which is why you can have that amazing experience where you go out with someone to somewhere and something happened and you both have a completely different reading about how that unfold, or you have an argument and they right and you right because you see the things very differently. So understand that you have the capacity to cultivate how you're going to read what's going on, and you can orient yourself into seeing it as a gift rather than as a disturbance, even when it doesn't feel good. Like this boring sort of obsession with just all of it's got to be comfortable and all of it's got to be sort of. No.
Yeah.
It's okay to be bored. It's okay to be, sort of like if you just don't feel good, be okay with not being okay.
Yeah.
That's curiosity that's really worthwhile developing.
Yeah. Michael, I love this. I've absolutely loved this conversation. It's been very deep and philosophical, and it's and woo woo, some woo woo in there, and they're the conversations I absolutely love. So thank you. Now, where can people find you to do some coaching with, and to have further deeper conversations with, whatever they want to do? Because I reckon you are worth chasing down. So where can people? My pleasure. Where can people find you?
So the easiest way is if you want to connect with me on social media. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but the word positive neuro, which is NEURO, and then plasticity.
Yeah.
Tagline: Positive Neuroplasticity is my handle on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me on LinkedIn if you look for mindfulness coaching, or just look for my name, Michael Bartura. My website used to be positive-neuroplasticity.com.au, but it is a mouthful. So if you look for happyhabits.com.au, happy habits essentially positive neuroplasticity. But yeah, if you just Google my name, you'll find my website, you'll find my social media. Please reach out. I'm most grateful that my my interaction, my engagement with life is in the capacity of being able to sort of interact with people and have those sort of conversations. And here is the most kind of bizarre and yet exciting thing for me that I've discovered. You don't need to change a lot of your thinking to be a lot happier.
Yep.
In other words, what are the 20% of your thinking that creates 80% of your experience? That can be changed in a couple of conversations. You don't need a lifetime coaching. You certainly don't need to take a program. Although I run those, I have programs around positive neuroplasticity that I've written and I facilitate. But sometimes you just need an hour of, reorienting the way that you think, and you will be a lot happier. So please don't hesitate to reach out for a chat. I delight in engaging with people who wants to change themselves and be part of this amazing, incredible experience called life. So,
well, I have absolutely loved this, and I really do hope people reach out to you, because I'm going to put all those things in the show notes anyway. But because I just think that you've got such a beautiful handle on it, and you just got such a beautiful attitude, and your vibration is moving out into the world to make it the entire frequency better, and that's what we need a lot more of. So thank you.
Getting hot behind the ears, Karen. and may I point out that back to this idea that you only see as a minute part of what actually happened. We usually tend to see who we are anyway. So what you see is also what you deliver to the. I really appreciate you inviting me on this, and joyful to have that conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so very much.
Take care.
See you, Michael.